Today we're talking about the death of Saul, and this kind of pauses the story of David, but it opens the door for David to become king.
It's really the death of a dream is what it is.
Yeah, because they were hoping for a king that would come and make all their wildest dreams come true, and instead they got a wicked king.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about today on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forrester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So, Jeff.
Yes.
You and I both started our careers as pastors in high school ministry, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So, I used to have this book called Would You Rather? And I would ask my students these questions that were written.
Right.
And some of them were pretty challenging.
They're hard. They can be really difficult.
They can be really difficult.
Yeah.
So this is sort of very challenging. It's not a fun Would You Rather, but I found it very interesting. So I used to ask this all the time.
Okay.
So I'm prepping you.
Okay.
So here it is.
Okay.
I'm
nervous.
Yes, well, you should be. This one said, would you rather eat a hamburger in front of a starving child or kick a puppy?
Oh, why? Why do you?
Well, I mean, this is the way the book was written.
Why are those my two choices?
Yeah, they're terrible. They're both terrible choices.
Well,
but pick one. You got to pick one.
Can you eat a puppy in front of a starving child?
Oh my goodness! Wow.
A puppy hamburger?
Wow. Why would that? Why would that be better?
Well, why would you ask that question at all? That's what I'm saying. Absurd questions
get
absurd answers.
It was in the book. You know what? We could leave it at that.
Yeah.
Because either option is just horrific.
That's right.
So
a hamburgered puppy is horrible. Why would you do that?
Why do you keep on mentioning hamburger puppies?
Well, you're talking about starving children.
Puppy hamburgers.
And it's terrible. I don't like your questions. That's it. Tomorrow I'm asking the question.
Oh, well, deal.
All right. Okay.
All right.
That's terrible. I don't even approve. I don't.
You're still going on.
Yes,
we have a scripture to go through.
I really dislike that. Okay. To everybody listening, I am very sorry for Chris's bad choices of questions to start with. Okay. So here we go. We're talking today. It's the death of Saul. So much is happening. It's back and forth. It's Saul, it's David. It's Saul, it's David. It's Philistines and Amalekites. It's raiding and alliances and all these things going on. And then finally, the Philistines kind of pin Saul and his sons in. And this is the end of it for Saul, which opens the door for David. Because remember, we talked about how David wouldn't kill Saul because Saul was God's anointed.
Yeah, he had several opportunities, didn't do it.
Yeah, but it didn't bother the Philistines. So that's what happens right here. So in 1 Samuel chapter 31, that's what we're reading. We're reading from the NLT, and it says, Now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, Take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come to run me through and taunt and torture me. But his armor-bearer was afraid and would not do it, so Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and his troops all died together that same day. When the Israelites on the other side of the Jezreel Valley and beyond Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off Saul's head and stripped off his armor. Then they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death in their pagan temple and to the people throughout the land of Philistia. They placed his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of the city of Beth-shan. But when the people of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their mighty warriors traveled through the night to Beth-shan and took the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall, and they brought them to Jabesh, where they burned the bodies. And then they took their bones and buried them beneath the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days.
Wow.
So that's a pretty rough end to...
I'm starting to think that my question was mild compared to this chapter.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there were no beheadings or burnings, right?
Right. Yeah, my question was mild. So it's interesting here that stands out. What do you observe? What sticks out from the story?
Yeah.
For me is that Saul died the way that he sort of entered into his kingdom. Not kingdom, but like to become king.
Yeah.
Because, he didn't consult God. He didn't ask God what to do. He didn't ask for advice. He sort of died and went out the way that he lived, which was, him in control.
Yeah.
And he asks his, his armor bearer, and that, by the way, is a person who, has a shield and, carries weapons for the king in this case, or a soldier. And then, he asks him to kill him. And so he takes matters in his own hands. So there's a lot happening here. Jonathan dies. That's all that's mentioned, just one verse.
Yeah, yeah.
Jonathan gets killed. Jonathan's like David's best friend.
Right. And we didn't mention it, but I mean, there were other times throughout the book of 1 Samuel where Jonathan's out there fighting these massive battles, and it's just him and a few men having great victories. And so Jonathan was a tremendous warrior. But in this instance, God had taken his hand off the house of Saul. And there are consequences to our extended family members and the people in our circles when we wind up being the ones rebelling against God. And so you find Jonathan, who seems to be a good man, falling next to his father. Yeah. That was the end of the family line of Saul, ascending to the throne.
Yeah, and it would have had to have been that way for David to really step in.
Right.
So when God anointed David through Samuel, God had this in mind the whole time, where God knew it was going to end this way. I should say that. But here's what I want to go ahead and say is that it's interesting to me that the armor bearer was given a command that he didn't want to do.
Right.
And so here's the king saying, kill me. And so he's thinking like, I can't commit murder because you're a defenseless person.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, he is the servant of the king. So it's really kind of, I used to read this to my high school students. I used to talk about like what happens when your parents, who you're commanded to obey, gives you a command that goes directly against godly advice or God's word.
Yeah, this would apply to bosses. This applies to governments.
That's right.
Anytime that you're commanded to do something that's against God's word, I think you can consult this guy's struggle.
Yeah, and the fact that he didn't do it.
Right.
And so for those listening who don't know this, when you say, "Oh, just fall on your sword," that phrase comes from the Bible.
Right.
And so what they would do is they would take their sword and they would put the handle of the sword on the ground, or put it up like at a 45-degree angle and put it against a rock or something like this. And then they would use the weight of their body and just fall on their sword. And even though that is horrific,
right,
it really was the better option, being captured by the Philistines, alive.
Well, he was afraid of this. I mean, he would have known Samson's story.
Right.
When the Philistines, they were famous for torturing and mutilating bodies and all that kind of stuff. And so he didn't want to go through that. Now, it says that he was severely wounded in this passage. There's other translations that would say he was mortally wounded. So he was going to die.
Oh, wow.
Right? So he was dying, and he just didn't want them to do, he didn't want to be alive when they got there.
Right.
So it sure seems like probably what was happening was the Philistines are fighting uphill Mount Gilboa. And of course, you got the king at the top, and it looks like everybody's surrounded, and all Saul's mighty men begin to fall. And finally, Abinadab and Jonathan and his sons fall. The greatest fighters are at the top. And then next thing you know, he's completely surrounded. He knows it's coming quickly. And it was the Philistine archers who got him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here they are on the battlefield, and Saul's like, I want to end my life because I don't want to be captured.
Right.
It's
which is a cowardly kind of a thing a little bit, right? Fearful. I don't know if it's cowardly. It's certainly fearful. He's so afraid of what's going to happen next, and he doesn't want to face the music.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it sort of reminds me of the end of The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise.
Really?
Did you see that?
Probably, but I don't remember.
Yeah, well, I totally have that in my mind. That was, in that case, that was honorable because he wanted to die a warrior's death, a samurai's death.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with this whatsoever.
In this situation, what you have is this young guy, probably the armor bearer, who's faced with this dilemma of, do I obey my king, but then if I do, I'm committing murder, or do I disobey my king, and in essence, then I'm committing treason.
Right.
Right? So he's really struggling back and forth as to what he should do. And finally, he refuses to commit murder.
Which is the right choice.
Right.
Yeah.
And in this situation, then, I think it's important. I love using the New Living Translations, the Life Application Bible. And the note says, for verses 3 and 4, it says, Saul's armor bearer faced a moral dilemma. Should he carry out a sinful order from a man he was supposed to obey? He knew he should obey his master, the king, but he also knew murder was wrong. Particularly, he knew that it was wrong to kill the Lord's anointed king, and he decided not to kill Saul. There's a difference between following an order with which you don't agree and following one you know is wrong. Mm-hmm. It's never right or ethical to carry out a sinful act, no matter who gives the order or what the consequences for disobedience may be. What shapes your choice when you face a moral dilemma? Of course, it has to be Scripture. Right. It's the only way, because that's the only way we know what is moral and right. And have the courage to follow God's law above human commands. I think that in this situation, that phrase that says there's a difference between following an order with which you don't agree and following one you think is morally wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times, because if we're not careful, we make our own opinions be the definition of what is moral.
Yeah.
Right? And morality shifts. It's always situational unless you root it in God's words. Once you root morality in God's words, what God says, then it's not just your opinion anymore. It's what God's words say. And so now morality is not moving and shifting situationally. It's always true. It's always right.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what this guy finally settled in on is, I'm not going to murder because God says don't murder. Yeah.
So when I was in college, I was in Missouri. My wife was in Ohio. And I would come back every chance that I got on, every summer, every, big long break at Christmas time that lasted for about a month. And every time that I did that, the job that I was working for down there would say, hey, we're not going to hold your job. You're going to have to get a new one. And I'd say, that's fine. And sometimes they would hire me back, and sometimes they wouldn't. Mm-hmm. But I didn't care. I just wanted to go home and see, my girlfriend, who's now my wife. So anyway, consequently, I had a lot of sales jobs. And I hopped from job to job to job to job, and found out that I was pretty good at sales, made some really good money. But I found out that I was only really good if I believed in the product.
Right.
So if the company had integrity, and the company was, the product was really good, I did really well. Well, I actually worked for this company very briefly called Techmatic Adjustable Bed Company, which was a knockoff of the Craftmatic Adjustable Bed Company, right? Mm-hmm. With the thing. So here's what they did. They would mail out these postcards, and they would say, if you want a price, mail it back then. And then they would mail them in, and those were our leads. So we have these older people who are like, please tell me the price.
Right.
And I would call them, and I wouldn't send a salesman, because I was the guy who sent the salesman. I wouldn't send a salesman to their house unless I was able to guess how much money they had. It was a horrible company. Wow. So I would say, oh, you own a farm. And then I'd have to make something up. They told me to lie. And they said, oh, my brother owns a farm. So, how many acres? And I would have to sort of assess, oh, yeah, these guys have money to pay for a $10,000 bed or $8,000 bed. So it was horrific.
Wow.
And so anyway, I realized that I was doing okay, but I couldn't get ahead and be the number one salesman like I had before in other companies without lying. And then finally I just said, I can't do it, man.
Right.
I can't do it. And they're like, you have to lie. And I'm like, I will not lie. And so I quit.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I think a lot of people get faced in their careers. They get faced with circumstance like that. Do I provide for myself and my family?
Yeah.
But if I do, I'm going to have to sacrifice my integrity. Or do I just go ahead and sacrifice my integrity and, benefit from it? And a lot of times I think Christians wind up making decisions that they never thought they would make. But it was all in the name of, well, it's just necessary to get ahead, or it's what everybody in this industry does. And I think you chose the right path, and that is get out of that industry.
Right. That's right.
Get out of that thing.
Hey, I want to read another note from my Life Application Study Bible, same as what you're reading. Mm-hmm. Verses 3-4, when it talks about Saul, it says, Saul was tall, handsome, strong, and rich and powerful, but this was not enough to make him someone we should emulate. He was large physically, but he was small in God's eyes. He was handsome, but his sin made him ugly. He was strong, but his lack of faith made him weak. He was rich, but he was spiritually bankrupt. He can give orders to many, but he couldn't command their respect and allegiance. Mm-hmm. Saul looked good on the outside, but he was decaying on the inside. A right relationship with God and strong character are much more valuable than a good-looking exterior.
Oh, yeah.
And I read that, and I thought, man, that describes so many people who are gifted and blessed to look so good on the outside. They're blessed with so many things, wealth, talent, all these different things. And yet so many stories over my life and yours, we've talked to people and they found themselves feeling empty, spiritually bankrupt, without purpose, all these different things. And I read that and thought, man, that's true today.
Yeah. If you have those things, you have a leg up on everybody else, right? And so we look at them and go, those people should be great. They should take over the world. They should do great things. And a lot of times we think, if only I had those things. But it turns out that they're so superficial, and that really what matters is on the inside. And Jesus challenged the Pharisees later on in the Gospels, where he says, you're doing everything right from a religious standpoint on the outside. Mm-hmm. But on the inside, you're full of dead men's bones. He said, you're like a tomb. You're all whitewashed on the outside, and you're full of dead men's bones.
I can't even imagine that that being told of me.
Yeah.
You know, just what Jesus was not shy about his words.
I think that there's an issue here that is maybe has some current social angle to it, and it's this: some people would look at what Saul was asking for as a mercy killing. Would you please kill me so I don't go through this torture? And this young man wouldn't do it. This is kind of at the core, I think, of a lot of the life issues that we look at today. Is it okay to end a life for the benefit, for some benefit or whatever? Euthanasia is cropping up in some states in the U.S., but is, acceptable in a few countries in Europe. The idea of ending a life in a mercy way as opposed to, dying a natural death. And that really is, this is one of the only spots in the Bible that deals with this issue.
Wow.
And this guy refuses to kill the king because he's God's anointed. And if we think about the idea that every human being is made in the image of God, right, that then the value of that life, it's not mine to take, right, would be a big part of that. The only time that God endorses that would be from a government standpoint for murder and horrendous crimes. But other than that, there's never a time where it's like, okay, yeah, go ahead and just kill him from a mercy standpoint.
Well, to be clear, since you brought that up, I don't think you're talking about somebody who has no quality of life where the wife has to pull the plug.
Well, no. When the doctors come to you and tell you, this life is not sustainable, I don't think that you're required to continue sustaining that life.
Right.
But in this situation, what he was asking was, end my life. And there's a big difference between those two things.
Right.
So if Saul was not being artificially kept alive.
Gotcha.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Saul was alive and just wanted to avoid a bad situation that was coming. And the young man wouldn't do that. But when it comes to somebody who's being artificially kept alive and finally the doctors come and say there's nothing more we can do, well, I don't think that there's any kind of moral issue with regard to no longer artificially keeping that.
Yeah, I agree.
That heart beating.
I just wanted to make sure our listeners didn't.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Hey, there's so many things. I mean, it's amazing how the Bible addresses everyday difficult decisions.
Yeah, you're right.
And this is what I think we were referencing just a minute ago. Go back to the Bible, because the Bible doesn't shift and move around. Public opinion does. What's currently popular today and acceptable today may be different from what was acceptable or popular, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So it makes it really, really difficult for a Christian to know, what should I do in this situation? And so when you're able to go back to Scripture and go, okay, this guy's not being propped up, held alive artificially, so then I shouldn't touch that life. That's not my life to touch.
Yeah, so in the Old Testament, you'll find the names are very weird. You'll find that the cities are weird, and even the culture is completely different. But what does not change are the godly principles, which is what you just said, and then also the tendency for the human tendency, the human instinct, the spirit, the struggle, the things that we can relate to. We see evidence here in the Bible thousands of years ago, and it's completely relatable because we deal with the same things.
Yeah.
Hey, by the way, side note, I've been to Beth Shan.
Oh, have you?
So what's interesting is that they said that they cut off Saul's head and they hung his body from the wall of the castle on the fortress of Beth Shan. So it would be on a mountain. So just a huge city on a hill, because every great fortress was on a hill because it was hard to overtake.
Right.
And so that would have been properly displayed. And so when we stood at the base and we looked up at the hill, they said, well, that would have been Beth Shan, or the original Beth Shan where Saul's body hung. And so when I'm standing in the valley and I'm looking up, I'm thinking, everybody can see Saul's body.
Yeah.
So it was displayed not just on a wall of a house, but on top of this mountain where everybody could see. And that's part of what Saul was fearing. Like if they did that to him while he was dead, what would they have done to him had he been alive? Yeah. So we climbed up the mountain, and then we saw the remains of that wall. We saw the remains of that wall. It was the foundation, really.
Yeah.
But it was the actual foundation of that actual fortress.
Yeah.
And so I just thought, wow, this would have been exactly where, because behind you is another mountain. So, in front of you, the whole valley is in front of you. So I took a photo, and I actually thought to myself, wow, this is where this happened.
Yeah.
And so I was right there on the same piece of real estate.
So what a way to go. I mean, he started off his career kind of honoring God, but very quickly shifts to honoring himself and doing whatever he wants to do and not obeying God. God removes his blessing from him, and then he kind of runs amok. He runs into all kinds of spiritual issues and evil and trying to kill David and all these things, and then finally dies in shame. It's a pretty rough way to go when you decide to throw God off from your life and just do your own thing, especially when you've been following the Lord, right? And so he winds up suffering this terrible humiliation at the end of his career. And I think it wasn't only his loss, but, as we referenced in the roll-in, the people lost out on this because this is kind of the end of their dream. They thought, man, if we could just have a king like all the other nations have kings, we'll be glorious and all of our wildest dreams will come true. And they were putting their trust in man. And I would just say, I think that over the last, 50 years, it doesn't matter which political party you put your trust in. When we put our trusts in men, we'll be disappointed, right? Humans will always disappoint us. And so we have to be careful to not think that it's going to be humans that are going to provide for us or take care of us or give us what we need. We have to look for our hope and trust in God.
Yeah. And then one more comment before we close. I would say the idea that we've mentioned several times, death of a dream.
Yeah.
It wasn't God's dream.
No.
It was their dream.
No.
So many times in our lives, we have ambitions or plans or ideas, and then we find out that, that those things don't come to pass. And we mourn that because that's what we wanted. But we realize it's not God's plan. It was our plan. And so in this case, it was the death of a dream. But if it's not God's plan, then just let it go.
It was always going to end this way.
Right.
God had told them before it even started, that it wasn't going to turn out the way they wanted it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
they just didn't believe him.
Yeah. So let's just learn to, surrender to God's plans for our lives and not to hang on to that which we hope for ourselves that necessarily isn't a good thing.
Yeah.
So, well, hey, listen, tomorrow we're going to continue. We're going to pick back up with David now having,
That's correct.
Walking into the throne without Saul being there.
Right.
So we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.